Hook. The first time Thomas laid eyes on Julian, it wasn't in some smoky, clandestine bar in the village where men's hands brushed in the dim light, heavy with unspoken things. It was under the unforgiving fluorescent glare of a police station, with the acrid smell of stale coffee and fear hanging in the air. Julian was sitting on a bench, a splash of impossible color in the drabness of the room, a streak of paint on his cheek like a defiant star. He was smiling, a slow, languid smile that seemed to say he knew a secret the rest of the world wasn't ready for. And in that moment, Thomas, a man who had survived the battlefields of Korea, knew he was looking at a different kind of war, one he wasn't sure he was brave enough to fight.
Part 1. The City of Whispers. Chapter 1. The year was 1953, and New York City was a city of whispers. It whispered of communists in the government, of atomic bombs that could fall from the sky, and of men who loved other men. Thomas Callahan heard the whispers every day. He heard them in the tight-lipped silence of his fellow dock workers when he failed to join in their crass jokes about women. He heard them in the suspicious glances of his landlady when he had no young lady to bring home. He lived in a world of shadows, a world he had become adept at navigating. Thomas was a man built of straight lines and hard angles, his body honed by the army and the docks. He had a square jaw, eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a silence that he wore like a second skin. He had come home from the war with a medal for bravery and a secret that felt like shrapnel lodged deep in his soul. He had held a dying soldier in his arms, a boy from his platoon named Daniel, and in those last, desperate moments, Daniel had confessed his love for him. And in the mud and the blood, he had felt a flicker of something he had long suppressed, a terrifying and undeniable recognition. He had buried that feeling along with Daniel, but it followed him, a ghost in the daylight. He sought solace in the anonymity of the city, in the rhythm of his work, and in the blessed numbness of a few beers at a local pub at the end of the day. He kept his head down, his desires locked away in the most fortified part of his mind. That night, the night he saw Julian, had started like any other. A brawl had broken out on the docks, a stupid, drunken affair over a misplaced crate. Thomas, ever the reluctant peacekeeper, had tried to intervene and had earned a split lip for his troubles. The police had been called and everyone involved was hauled down to the local precinct. And there he was, Julian. He was everything Thomas was not. Where Thomas was solid and subdued, Julian was a riot of color and movement. He had a cascade of dark, unruly curls that fell into his eyes, a slender frame draped in clothes that were just a little too flamboyant for the era, a brightly patterned scarf around his neck, a jacket that seemed a shade too vibrant, and that smile. It was a weapon, a shield, and an invitation all at once. Julian was being questioned by a beefy, red-faced officer who looked at him with a mixture of disgust and confusion. "Says here you were caught loitering," the officer said, the word dripping with insinuation. "I am an artist," Julian replied, his voice a smooth, melodic tenor that cut through the gruffness of the station. "The world is my canvas. I was merely appreciating the aesthetic qualities of the moonlight on the Hudson." The officer grunted, clearly unimpressed. Thomas watched, fascinated. He had never seen anyone so openly, so effortlessly themselves. It was like watching a rare, exotic bird in a cage full of pigeons. Their eyes met across the room. Julian's smile widened, a glint of something knowing in his dark eyes. Thomas felt a jolt, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. He looked away, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was dangerous to look, dangerous to be seen. They were released a few hours later. The charges for the brawl dropped with a stern warning. Thomas walked out into the cool night air, the city lights blurring before his eyes. He just wanted to go home, to the safety of his small, lonely apartment. Rather dreary end to an evening, wouldn't you say? Thomas turned. Julian was leaning against the precinct wall, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The smoke curled around his face, making him look ethereal, unreal. "I suppose," Thomas mumbled, his voice hoarse. "You're the strong, silent type, I take it. A man of action, not words. I saw you try to break up that foolishness on the docks." Thomas just nodded, unsure of what to say. He was used to being invisible. To be seen, truly seen, by this man was unnerving. "I'm Julian," he said, extending a hand. His handshake was surprisingly firm, his fingers long and slender. "Thomas." "Well, Thomas," Julian said, taking a final drag from his cigarette and flicking it into the gutter. "It seems we are both men who find ourselves in the wrong place at the wrong time."
Chapter 2. The encounter with Julian left an indelible mark on Thomas. He found himself thinking about the artist at odd moments, while he was hauling crates on the docks, while he was staring out at the gray expanse of the river, while he was lying in his narrow bed at night, the city's symphony a distant lullaby. He replayed their brief conversation over and over in his mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. He started walking through Greenwich Village in the evenings, a place he had always avoided. The village was a world unto itself, a bohemian enclave of artists, writers, and radicals. It was a place of coffee houses where people debated poetry and politics until the early hours of the morning, of smoky jazz clubs where the music was as intoxicating as the illicit liquor, and of hidden corners where people who didn't fit in anywhere else could, for a fleeting moment, find a sense of belonging. He didn't know what he was looking for, or perhaps he did and was just afraid to admit it to himself. He would wander the winding streets, a solitary figure in his plain work clothes, feeling like a spy in a foreign land. He saw men who walked with a certain sway in their hips, who spoke with a flourish of their hands, who looked at each other with an intensity that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. He saw women in trousers and short hair who held hands in the shadows of doorways. It was a world he had only ever heard about in hushed, derogatory tones, a world that was supposed to be sinful and corrupt. But as he walked, he saw not sin, but a vibrant, defiant life force. One evening, drawn by the sound of laughter and music, he found himself outside a small, unassuming bar with a green door. The sign above it was so faded, it was almost illegible. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. This was a line he had never dared to cross. To step inside would be to acknowledge a part of himself he had kept buried for so long. He thought of Daniel, of the unspoken words that had hung between them in the chaos of the war. He thought of Julian, of the fearless way he had faced the police officer, the way his smile had challenged the world to do its worst. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and the sweet, cloying smell of cheap perfume and spilt beer. A jazz trio was playing in the corner, the mournful notes of a saxophone weaving a spell over the crowded room. The patrons were a mix of men, some in sharp suits, some in bohemian disarray. They were all talking, laughing, their faces animated in the soft glow of the table lamps. Thomas stood by the door, his back pressed against the wall, feeling exposed and out of place. He ordered a beer from a bartender with a knowing look in his eyes and retreated to a dark corner, content to just watch. He saw men dancing together, their movements tentative at first, then more confident as they lost themselves in the music. He saw men leaning in close, their heads bent together in intimate conversation. He saw a community, a fragile, secret world carved out of the heart of a hostile city. And then he saw him. Julian was holding court at a table in the center of the room, a glass of wine in his hand, a rapt audience hanging on his every word. He was telling a story, his hands gesturing dramatically, his face alive with expression. He looked even more vibrant here in his natural element than he had in the sterile environment of the police station. As if sensing he was being watched, Julian looked up and his eyes locked with Thomas's. A slow smile spread across his face, the same smile that had haunted Thomas's thoughts. He raised his glass in a silent toast, and then, with a subtle nod, invited Thomas to join him. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to turn and run, to retreat to the safety of his solitary existence. But he was tired of running. He was tired of the shadows. He made his way through the crowded room, his movements stiff and awkward. The men at Julian's table looked at him with curiosity, their conversation faltering. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice a warm caress, "I'd like you to meet Thomas. He's a man of few words, but I suspect he has a story to tell." Thomas felt his face flush. He mumbled a greeting and took the empty seat next to Julian. The men at the table introduced themselves, a playwright, a poet, a musician. They were all sharp, witty, and unapologetically themselves. They talked about art, about literature, about the latest play that was causing a scandal on Broadway. Thomas listened, feeling like an outsider looking in. He was a man of calloused hands and a simple life. What did he have to contribute to this world of ideas and words? Julian seemed to understand his discomfort. He turned to him, his eyes soft with an empathy that surprised Thomas. "So, Thomas," he said, his voice low so that only Thomas could hear, "what do you do when you're not rescuing damsels in distress on the docks?" Thomas was taken aback by the directness of the question. He had never been good at talking about himself. "I work," he said simply, "and I read." "What do you read?" Julian asked, his curiosity genuine. "I read history, mostly about the war." "The war," he said, the smile fading from his face. "A messy, brutal business. I'm glad you came home." There was an intimacy in his words that made Thomas's breath hitch. He felt a connection to this man, a sense of being understood that he had never felt before. They talked for hours, their conversation a world away from the witty banter of the rest of the table. Thomas found himself opening up in a way he had never had before. He told Julian about his childhood in a small town in Ohio, about his dreams of being a teacher before the war had derailed his life, about the suffocating loneliness of the city. Julian listened, his gaze never leaving Thomas's face. He spoke of his own life, of a wealthy, disapproving family in Boston, of his escape to the liberating chaos of the village, of his passion for painting. He spoke of beauty, of light, of the need to create something real and true in a world that was often ugly and false. As the night wore on, the bar began to empty. The jazz trio packed up their instruments, and the bartender started wiping down the tables. "It's late," Thomas said, the spell of the evening beginning to break. "Walk with me," Julian said, not as a question, but as a gentle command. They stepped out into the deserted streets of the village. The city was quiet now, the whispers silenced for a few precious hours. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the soft tap of their shoes on the pavement. Julian's studio was in a converted warehouse on the waterfront, not far from the docks where Thomas worked. It was a vast, open space with a wall of windows that looked out over the river. Canvases were propped up against the walls, some finished, some in various states of completion. The room smelled of turpentine and oil paint, a smell that Thomas found strangely comforting. Julian switched on a single lamp, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. He walked over to a large canvas that was covered with a sheet. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice soft. He pulled the sheet away, and Thomas gasped. It was a portrait of him. Julian had captured him perfectly, the stoic set of his jaw, the sadness in his eyes, the strength that was both his armor and his cage. But there was something else in the painting, something that Thomas had never seen in himself. There was a vulnerability, a longing, a flicker of hope in the darkness. "I saw it in you that night at the police station," Julian said, his voice a low murmur. "The storm and the calm, the fighter and the poet." Thomas couldn't speak. He was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown him. He had spent his whole life feeling invisible, and here was a man who had seen him, truly seen him in all his broken, beautiful complexity. He reached out and traced the line of his own jaw on the canvas, his fingers trembling. "It's," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears, "it's the truest thing I've ever seen." Julian moved closer, his presence a warm, solid weight in the quiet room. He gently took Thomas's hand, his fingers lacing with Thomas's. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated feeling that shot through Thomas's entire body. He looked at Julian, and in the artist's dark, expressive eyes, he saw a reflection of his own desire, his own fear, his own hope. The whispers of the city faded away, and for the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he was home. He leaned in, and Julian met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both a question and an answer, a beginning and an end, a surrender and a victory. In the heart of a city that demanded conformity, in the shadow of a society that condemned them, two men found a universe in each other's arms. And in the quiet of that waterfront studio, with the city lights twinkling like fallen stars, a love story began, a story that would be written in stolen glances, whispered words, and the defiant, unbreakable bond of two souls who had finally found their way out of the shadows and into the light.
Part 2. The Fragility of Light. Chapter 3. The kiss was a cataclysm. It shattered the fortress Thomas had built around his heart, and from the rubble, something new and terrifyingly beautiful began to grow. The days that followed were a blur of discovery, a secret spring in the midst of a city locked in the cold grip of conformity. Their world shrank to the confines of Julian's sprawling studio, a sanctuary of paint-splattered floors and canvases that held more truth than the world outside. Thomas had never known such intimacy. He would watch, mesmerized as Julian painted. Julian moved with a fierce, concentrated grace, his entire being poured onto the canvas. He was painting a new series, vibrant and abstract, full of bold colors and sharp, clashing lines. "It's the city," he explained, dabbing a streak of angry red next to a sliver of brilliant blue. All its energy, its beauty, its violence, all crammed together. That's what it feels like to be alive here. That's what it feels like to be us. In turn, Thomas found himself sharing parts of his life he had never spoken of. He brought Julian to the docks at dawn before the chaos of the day began. They stood on the pier, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of soft pink and orange, the water a shimmering sheet of glass. Thomas pointed out the ships, naming their ports of call: Liverpool, Marseille, Havana, places that were just words on a map, but which Julian saw as a tapestry of color and light. "You see the world in straight lines," Julian said as his hand found Thomas's in the pocket of his heavy coat. "The grid of the city, the keel of a ship, the discipline of your work. I see it in curves, in the chaos of a wave, the arc of a brushstroke." He squeezed Thomas's hand. "But somehow, our lines and curves have found a way to meet." It was Julian who coaxed the stories of the war out of him, not the tales of heroism he was expected to tell.
but the quiet, human moments. He finally spoke of Daniel, his voice thick with a grief he hadn't realized he still carried. He told Julian about the boy's easy laugh, his love for poetry, and the final desperate confession in the mud. Julian didn't flinch or judge. He simply listened, his hand resting on Thomas's back, a silent, steady anchor in the storm of memory. "You carry so much," Julian whispered later that night. As they lay in his bed, the city lights a distant constellation through the large studio window. "Let me help you carry it." And in the quiet darkness, Thomas allowed himself to be held, to be vulnerable, to be known. Their clandestine world was not without its rules. In public, they were friends, acquaintances, two men who happened to be walking in the same direction. There were no lingering touches, no gazes held for a moment too long. They learned to communicate in a language of subtleties, a raised eyebrow, a slight nod, a shared smile that was invisible to anyone else. They were ghosts in their own love story, haunting the edges of a world that refused to see them. The constant vigilance was exhausting. Every knock on the studio door sent a jolt of fear through Thomas. Every police siren in the distance made his muscles tense. He saw suspicion in the eyes of strangers, in the tight, disapproving frown of his landlady. The whispers he had once heard at the edges of his life were now a deafening roar. One evening, they ventured to a small cafe in the village that was known as a safe haven. It was a cozy place, filled with the aroma of coffee and the low murmur of conversation. They sat at a small table in the corner, a book of poetry open between them as a prop. For a brief, blissful hour, they could almost pretend to be normal. Suddenly the door burst open. Two burly policemen, their faces grim, strode into the room. The cheerful chatter died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The officers' eyes swept across the patrons, their gazes lingering on the tables where men sat with other men. "Just a routine check," one of them said, his voice laced with menace. But everyone knew what it was. It was a raid. It was harassment. It was a reminder of their precarious existence. The officers moved through the cafe, demanding identification, their questions sharp and accusatory. A young man at a nearby table, his face pale with terror, dropped his coffee cup, the shattering sound echoing the fragility of their carefully constructed world. Thomas felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He could feel the familiar adrenaline of a combat situation, the instinct to either fight or flee. He looked at Julian, expecting to see the same fear mirrored in his eyes. But Julian was preternaturally calm. He placed a steadying hand on Thomas's knee under the table and looked directly at the approaching officers, his expression one of polite, almost bored inquiry. When they reached their table, Julian simply raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. The policeman's eyes darted from Julian to Thomas, a sneer playing on his lips. "What's in the book?" he demanded, jabbing a thick finger at the collection of Walt Whitman poems. "Poetry," Julian replied, his voice even. "Surely you're not suggesting that's a crime?" There was a tense standoff, the officer's brutish authority pitted against Julian's unshakable composure. Thomas held his breath. He could feel the entire cafe holding his breath with him. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, the officer moved on. They left the cafe moments later, stepping out into the cold night air. Thomas was trembling, a mixture of fear and fury coursing through him. "How could you be so calm?" he demanded, his voice tight. "They could have arrested us. They could have—" He couldn't bring himself to say the words, beaten them, exposed them, ruined their lives. Julian stopped and turned to face him, his expression serious. "Because if I show them my fear, Thomas, they win," he said, his voice low and intense. "They want us to be afraid. They want us to hide in the shadows, to hate ourselves. My art, My love, my very existence is an act of defiance. I will not let them take that from me." Thomas looked at Julian, at the fire in his eyes, at the proud set of his shoulders. He was an artist not just with his paints, but with his life, crafting a masterpiece of courage in a world that sought to erase him. In that moment, Thomas's fear began to recede, replaced by a profound and overwhelming love. He had fallen for the man with the paint on his cheek. Now he was falling for the warrior beneath.
Chapter 4. The raid on the cafe was a stark reminder that their sanctuary was built on fault lines. The tremors of the world outside were beginning to shake its foundations. It wasn't just the police they had to fear. A new, more insidious threat was creeping across the country, a poison that seeped into every corner of society. It had a name: McCarthyism. The nation was in the grip of a Red Scare, a paranoid witch hunt for communists led by the belligerent Senator Joseph McCarthy. But there was another, lesser-known purge happening in its shadow, a Lavender Scare. An executive order had been signed declaring homosexuals a security risk, claiming they were more susceptible to blackmail by Soviet agents. It was a baseless, cruel justification for a systematic purge of gay men and lesbians from government jobs. The fear was palpable in the village. Friends and acquaintances disappeared overnight, their apartments suddenly empty, their phones disconnected. The playwright from Julian's circle, a witty, kind man named Arthur, lost his job at the State Department. He was interrogated, humiliated, and forced to name others. The community, once a source of strength, was now riddled with suspicion and fear. Who could you trust when your friend could become an informant to save their own skin? The Lavender Scare brought the fight to their doorstep. Julian's art, once a personal expression, became overtly political. His new paintings were darker, more chaotic, filled with shadowy figures and bars of oppressive black. He titled the series The Un-American, a direct challenge to the paranoid rhetoric of the era. "They say we are a threat to this country," he said to Thomas one night, his hands stained with black paint. "But they are the ones tearing it apart with their hatred and their fear." The growing danger created a rift between them. Thomas, with his soldier's pragmatism, urged caution. "You're putting a target on your back, Julian," he pleaded. "They're looking for people like you, people who won't stay silent. We need to be smarter, quieter." "Quiet," he shot back, his eyes flashing. "Quiet is what they want, Thomas. Quiet is surrender. I will not be quiet while they hunt us like animals." "This isn't a battlefield," Thomas argued, his voice rising. "You can't fight them head-on. This is about survival." "Survival is not enough," Julian's voice cracked with a passion that shook the room. "I don't want to just survive. I want to live. I want to love you without fear. Don't you?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and painful. Of course he did. But the fear was a part of him now, a cold, hard knot in his stomach that never went away. He had seen what men could do to each other in the name of an idea, and he knew that the enemy this time was not a foreign army, but his own countrymen. Their argument was interrupted by a frantic pounding on the studio door. Julian opened it to find a young man from the bar, his face ashen. "It's Arthur," he gasped, breathless. "He's been arrested again. They took him from his apartment." A wave of nausea washed over Thomas. Arthur was a good man. He was gentle, bookish, and posed no threat to no one. Julian grabbed his jacket. "Where did they take him?" "The precinct on Charles Street," the young man said. "Julian, no," Thomas said, grabbing his arm. "You can't go down there. It's a trap. They'll know you're one of us." "He's my friend," Julian said, his jaw set. "I can't just do nothing." "There is nothing you can do," Thomas insisted, his voice raw with desperation. "You'll just get yourself arrested, and I can't lose you." The admission, so raw and unplanned, stopped Julian in his tracks. He looked at Thomas, the anger in his eyes softening into something else, something infinitely more vulnerable. The chasm between them, carved by their different approaches to fear, was suddenly bridged by a shared terror of loss. "I know you're scared," Julian said. "I am too. But if we let our fear control us, if we abandon our own when they need us, then we have already lost." He gently removed Thomas's hand from his arm. "I'm not asking you to come with me," he said softly, "but I have to go." Thomas watched as Julian walked out the door, his slender frame swallowed by the darkness of the hallway. He was left alone in the vast studio, surrounded by Julian's defiant art, the silence ringing with their unspoken fears. Julian was right. Survival wasn't enough. But the cost of fighting, the cost of being seen, could be everything. And as the distant sound of a police siren cut through the night, Thomas was paralyzed by a terrible choice: to stay hidden in the shadows and risk losing the love of his life, or to step into the light and risk everything else.
Part 3. The Cold Resolve. Chapter 5. The silence Julian left behind was a living thing. It filled every corner of the studio, wrapping around Thomas like a shroud. He stood frozen, the ghost of Julian's last words, "I have to go," echoing in the vast space. For years, his life had been governed by a single overriding instinct: survival. He had survived the frozen hills of Korea, the back-breaking labor of the docks, the crushing loneliness of the city. Survival meant keeping your head down, staying invisible, never drawing the attention of the predators who stalked the edges of the world. But Julian didn't know how to be invisible. He was a supernova in a world of dying stars. And Thomas had allowed himself to be drawn into his orbit, to feel the warmth of his light. Now that light was heading directly into the heart of the darkness. He paced the length of the studio, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He looked at the portrait Julian had painted of him. The man on the canvas stared back, his eyes full of a sorrow Thomas knew intimately, but also a strength he had forgotten he possessed. He had been a soldier. He knew how to fight. He had just forgotten who or what he was fighting for. He thought of Arthur, with his gentle eyes and his nervous laugh being swallowed by the brutal machinery of the state. He thought of Julian, walking into that precinct armed with nothing but his courage, a courage that could get him killed. He thought of Daniel, dying in the mud, his last words a confession of a love he never got to live. The fear was still there, a cold metallic taste in his mouth. But beneath it, something else was stirring, a slow, burning rage. They were not security risks. They were not criminals. They were men who loved, who dreamed, who grieved, who created beauty in a world determined to crush it. He had been so focused on surviving that he had forgotten how to live. And what was the point of surviving in a world where you couldn't stand up for the people you loved? He stopped pacing. The decision settled over him, not with a crash, but with a quiet, solemn finality. He grabbed his worn jacket, the one that smelled of the sea and hard labor, and walked out the door, leaving the safety of the studio behind. The Charles Street precinct was an ugly brick fortress, its windows barred, its entrance emitting a sickly yellow light. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed through the heavy doors. The air inside was stale and thick with the smell of sweat and despair. A desk sergeant with a face like a bulldog eyed him with bored hostility. And then he saw him. Julian wasn't in a cell. He was standing near the sergeant's desk, engaged in a low, tense argument. A small, haggard group of men stood a few feet behind him, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. They were the familiar faces from the bar, the cafe, the secret tribe. Julian's back was to the door, but he must have felt Thomas's presence. He turned, and for a fleeting second, his composure broke. Relief, raw and profound, washed over his features before he masked it again. He gave Thomas a barely perceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that spoke volumes. "You came." Thomas walked over and stood beside him, a solid, unwavering presence. The simple act felt monumental. He was no longer on the sidelines.
He was in the fight. "I'm telling you, my friend has a right to legal counsel," Julian was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. The sergeant laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your friend was picked up for lewd behavior. He forfeited his rights when he chose to be a deviant." The slur was delivered with casual cruelty. Before Julian could retort, a crisp, clear voice cut through the tension. "That is an egregious misstatement of constitutional law, Sergeant." They all turned. A woman was approaching the desk. She was not tall, but she carried herself with an authority that made her seem to tower over everyone in the room. She was dressed in a smart, practical tweed suit. Her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes behind a pair of sharp spectacles missed nothing. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, placing a leather briefcase on the counter with a decisive snap. "I am an attorney, and I am here to inquire about the unlawful detainment of my client, Mr. Arthur Pembroke." The sergeant, who had been easily dismissing Julian, seemed momentarily thrown off balance. A woman? An attorney? Here in the middle of the night for a man like Arthur? It was an anomaly he didn't know how to process. "This is police business, lady," he grumbled. "It becomes my business when the police overstep their legal authority," she countered, her voice sharp as broken glass. She leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "Now I will ask you again, where are you holding Mr. Pembroke?" Thomas watched, fascinated. Here was a different kind of warrior, one who fought not with fists or bravado, but with words, with the law itself. Eleanor Vance, Ellie as they would come to know her, was a force of nature. After a tense standoff and the threat of a writ of habeas corpus, the sergeant grudgingly admitted that Arthur was being held for questioning and would likely be released in the morning with a citation. There was nothing more they could do, Knight. Ellie turned to address our small, anxious group. "Go home," she said, her tone softening slightly, though it lost none of its authority. "There's no use in you all getting arrested tonight. Don't give them an excuse. Meet me tomorrow, noon, my office." She scribbled an address on a card and handed it to Julian. "And come organized." She gave them a final appraising look, her eyes lingering on Thomas for a moment, then turned and walked out, her heels clicking with purpose on the linoleum floor. The group dispersed quickly, melting back into the shadows of the city. Thomas and Julian were the last to leave. The walk back to the studio was silent, but it was a different silence than the one that had separated them earlier. It was a silence of shared experience, of a bridge crossed together. Back in the sanctuary of the studio, the adrenaline of the night began to fade, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. "You came," Julian said, his voice soft. He was standing in front of his easel, his back to Thomas. "I told you once that you wouldn't let them win," Thomas said. "I guess I decided I wouldn't either." Julian turned to face him, his eyes shining in the dim light. He crossed the room and took Thomas's rough hands in his own. "I was afraid, Thomas. Not for me, for you. I brought you into this world. I didn't want it to destroy you." "You didn't bring me into it," Thomas replied, his grip tightening on Julian's hands. "You just showed me a part of myself that was already there. I was the one who was hiding from it." He looked around the room, at the canvases that blazed with color and truth. "I don't want to hide anymore." The argument that had divided them felt like a lifetime ago. The chasm between Julian's defiant idealism and Thomas's cautious pragmatism had closed. They were no longer two separate entities navigating the darkness, but a single unit, their strengths and fears intertwined. They had been forged into something new in the crucible of that ugly police station. They held each other for a long time, drawing strength from the simple fact of being together. The fear was still there, a cold shadow in the corner of the room.
They knew Arthur's arrest was not an end, but a beginning. A new, more dangerous chapter of their lives was starting. But as the first hints of dawn began to creep through the massive windows, painting the sky in shades of gray and lavender, the fear was no longer the only thing they felt. It was mingled with something else, something hard and unyielding. Resolve. They had an address, a time, and a purpose. They were going to meet the woman with the sharp eyes and the sharper mind. They were going to get organized. They were going to fight back. The light of their love was fragile, yes, but they were about to learn how to build a fortress around it.
Part 4. The Architecture of Resistance. Chapter 6. Eleanor Vance's office was on the 4th floor of a nondescript building in a quieter part of the village, a street lined with dusty bookshops and antique stores. The name on the door was a simple, discreet brass plate, E. Vance, Attorney at Law. The office itself was the woman in miniature, meticulously organized, ruthlessly efficient, and devoid of any unnecessary sentiment. Law books lined the walls, not for decoration but for use. Their spines were cracked, their pages tabbed with slips of paper. There were no family photographs on the desk, only neat stacks of files and a formidable-looking fountain pen. The only hint of softness was a single, slightly wilting violet in a small bud vase on the corner of her desk. Thomas and Julian arrived precisely at noon. They were not the first. The young man who had warned them about Arthur was there, along with a few other familiar faces from the precinct vigil. They huddled together in the small waiting area, a flock of nervous sparrows, their hushed whispers a stark contrast to the confident click of the secretary's typewriter in the adjoining room. Thomas felt the familiar sensation of being an outsider. These were men of words and ideas, artists and thinkers. He was a man of physical labor, his hands calloused, his mind more accustomed to the simple mechanics of a winch than the complex machinery of the law. Ellie emerged from her inner office, cutting through their anxiety like a ship's prow through water. "In here," she commanded, gesturing them into a small conference room. Once they were seated around a polished mahogany table, she did not waste time with pleasantries. She stood at the head of the table, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture ramrod straight. "Let's be clear about the situation you are in. You are not merely facing social disapproval. You are the targets of a coordinated federal policy." She proceeded to lay out the cold, hard facts of their existence. She spoke of Executive Order 10,450, signed by President Eisenhower that very year, which barred homosexuals from all federal employment as security risks. She explained the Lavender Scare that ran parallel to McCarthy's Red Scare, a purge that was quieter, but just as devastating. "They are not just looking for communists," she said, her eyes sweeping over their faces. "They are looking for you." She detailed the legal traps set for them, the vague statutes against lewd behavior, vagrancy, and disorderly conduct that were used by police as a pretext for harassment and arrest. She explained the devastating consequences. An arrest, even without a conviction, could lead to your name and address being printed in the newspaper. It meant the loss of your job, your apartment, your family. It meant becoming a pariah. The room was utterly silent. The abstract fear they lived with every day had been given a name, a structure, a legal framework. It was more terrifying than they had imagined. It was Julian who finally broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why are you helping us?" A flicker of something, weariness perhaps, or a deep old sadness passed through Ellie's eyes before being swiftly suppressed. "My brother was a brilliant cryptographer during the war. He helped break codes that saved thousands of lives.
Last year, he was dismissed from his position at the Pentagon. An anonymous accusation was made. They questioned him for 2 days. He lost his job, his security clearance, his life's work. She paused, her gaze distant. They called him a security risk, but the only thing my brother ever endangered was his own heart by loving the wrong person. This is not about national security. It is a war on difference, and I do not, as a principle, cede ground to bullies. The story settled over the room, a somber testament to the human cost of the policies she had described. Thomas felt a profound respect for this woman, a respect forged in shared loss. Her fight was not abstract. It was deeply personal. "So, what do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. The question was practical, grounded. It seemed to hang in the air, a plea for a plan. Ellie nodded as if she had been waiting for that exact question. She moved to a small blackboard on the wall. "We stop being easy targets," she said, picking up a piece of chalk. "We build a system. We create an architecture of resistance." What she outlined was not a plan for a revolution, but a blueprint for survival. First, she handed them each a small typed pamphlet. "If you are arrested, read this, memorize it. Rule 1, you do not resist. Rule 2, you say nothing except your name and address. Rule 3, you say, 'I will not answer any questions without my attorney present.' You will say that phrase over and over again until they put me in a room with you." Second, she drew a diagram on the board, a series of names connected by lines. "This is a telephone tree. We need a way to communicate quickly and discreetly. When someone is in trouble, one call sets off a chain. The final call comes to me. No names are used on the phone. We develop a code. The package is late, could mean an arrest. The library is open, could mean it's safe." Thomas listened, a sense of grim recognition dawning on him. This was strategy. This was logistics. It was the same kind of thinking required to move troops or supplies across a battlefield. For the first time, he saw a way he could contribute, a place for his particular skills. "How do we fund this?" he asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. "Bail, legal fees, it will cost money. We can't keep records of donors. A list like that would be a weapon against us." Ellie gave him a look of keen approval. "Exactly. We need a fund. Cash only, held by someone unimpeachable, collected in places they wouldn't think to look. A coffee can in the back of a bookstore, a collection plate at a poetry reading. It requires absolute trust." They talked for 2 more hours, hammering out the details. They gave their nascent organization a deliberately boring name, the Matachine Society, New York chapter, borrowing the name from a similar group that had started in California. It sounded academic, harmless. Julian, initially impatient with the meticulous planning, began to see the artistry in it, the creation of an invisible structure of support. He suggested designs for the pamphlets, ways to make them small enough to be hidden in a shoe or a wallet. By the time they left Ellie's office, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows down the street. The city looked the same, but their relationship to it had been irrevocably altered. They were not longer just hiding from it. They were organizing within it, building something in its cracks and fissures. As they walked towards the village, Thomas felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The fear hadn't vanished, but it now had a counterpart: purpose. He was no longer just Julian's lover, a man adrift in a world he didn't understand. He was part of something larger than himself. "Her brother," Julian said quietly, breaking the silence. "She's building a fortress to protect us because no one was there to protect him."
"We'll help her build it," Thomas said. It was not a promise made in the heat of passion, but a statement of cold, hard fact. He reached out, and for the first time in the bright light of day, on a public street, he took Julian's hand. It was a small gesture, lasting only a second before he let go, but it was a profound act of defiance. It was the laying of the first stone. They were not just surviving anymore. They were fighting back.
Part 5. Echoes in the Dark, Chapter 7. The architecture of resistance was built in shadows, its mortar a mixture of fear and ferocious hope. The Mattachine Society of New York was less an organization and more a phantom network, its meetings held in the back rooms of sympathetic bookstores, the basements of churches whose pastors looked the other way, or, most often, in the cavernous, paint-flecked sanctuary of Julian's studio. The meetings were a study in contrasts. There was the nervous energy of men who spent their entire lives looking over their shoulders, combined with a newfound, steely determination. They were a motley crew, postal workers, teachers who spoke in careful, abstract terms about their roommates, a few defiant artists like Julian, and even a quiet, well-dressed man who worked on Wall Street and whose hands trembled whenever a police siren passed. Thomas found his place in the silence and the systems. He became the keeper of the fund, a role he accepted with the solemn gravity of a man entrusted with his unit's last canteen of water. His methodical nature, once a source of quiet shame in a world that prized boisterous confidence, was now their greatest asset. He devised a collection system of unparalleled discretion. A hollowed-out book in a lending library, a loose brick behind a particular bar, a weekly debt paid to a newsstand vendor who was a trusted ally. He never wrote down names, only dates and amounts in a small ledger filled with a code only he and Ellie understood. The heavy canvas bag of cash, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Julian's studio, felt to Thomas like the most important thing he had ever been tasked to protect. It was more than money. It was bail, it was legal defense, it was a lifeline. It was their collective refusal to be broken. Julian, meanwhile, became their propagandist, a title he embraced with ironic glee. He transformed Ellie's dry, legalistic pamphlet into a small, pocket-sized work of art. Using his skills as a printmaker, he created a woodcut for the cover, a stylized image of a key unlocking a padlock. The text inside was clear, concise, and empowering. He started a clandestine newsletter called The Lantern, a single mimeographed sheet of paper filled with Ellie's legal updates, coded news of arrests and entrapments, and Julian's own fiery, anonymous editorials that spoke of pride and dignity. They would leave copies of The Lantern between the pages of books in the library or slip them into the pockets of coats at the bar. It was a whisper, an echo in the dark, but for men starving for a voice, it was a thunderclap. The system was an invisible machine, humming quietly beneath the surface of the city. For months it remained untested, a theory, a set of protocols waiting for the inevitable crisis. It came on a damp, chilly Tuesday in November. The call came not to Thomas but to Julian. The telephone tree was designed with redundancies. The voice on the other end was strained, speaking the coded phrase they had rehearsed. The delivery for Mr. Hemlock is overdue. Hemlock. It was the code for Washington Square Park, a known meeting place for men and therefore a frequent target for police entrapment. Julian's face went pale. He held the receiver for a moment after hanging up, then turned to Thomas, his eyes dark with urgency. "He'd started," he said. The machine kicked into gear. Julian made the next call on the tree, while Thomas, his movements swift and sure, went to the loose floorboard. He counted out the standard bail amount, his hand steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. He wrapped the cash in oilcloth and slipped it into the deep pocket of his coat. They met on a predetermined street corner, a place with multiple exits, and simply exchanged a look. No words were necessary. Julian would continue the chain of calls. Thomas was the runner. His destination was a small, all-night diner 2 blocks from the precinct, the designated rendezvous point. He took a seat in a back booth, ordered a cup of coffee he didn't touch, and waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. He watched the reflection of the street in the diner's window, his senses on high alert, cataloging every passing car, every pedestrian. This was a soldier's waiting, a familiar, gut-wrenching state of suspended animation. Finally, Ellie Wyance walked in. She was wearing a trench coat, her face set and grim. She slid into the booth opposite him without a word. Thomas pushed a folded newspaper across the table. The money was tucked inside. Ellie took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. It was the only acknowledgement that passed between them. "The charge is public nuisance," she said, her voice a low murmur. "An undercover officer, the usual sordid story. The boy is young, terrified. His name is Peter." "Will they print his name?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. It was their biggest fear. "That's what I'm going to prevent," Ellie said. She stood up, the newspaper with its precious cargo held firmly in her hand. "Go home, Thomas. Be careful." She was gone as quickly as she had appeared. Thomas stayed for another 10 minutes, then paid for his coffee and left, taking a circuitous route back to the studio, making sure he wasn't followed. When he finally pushed open the studio door, Julian was there, pacing a trench in the wooden floor. He stopped when he saw Thomas, his body language screaming 1,000 questions. "Ellie has it," Thomas said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "The boy's name is Peter." They didn't sleep that night. They sat in the semi-darkness, the city a glittering, indifferent beast outside the window, and waited. They were 2 small cogs in a machine they had helped build, a machine that was now churning in the darkness, trying to pull one of their own back from the brink. The fate of a stranger named Peter had become inextricably linked with their own. Just before dawn, the phone rang, its shrill sound tearing through the quiet tension. Julian snatched it up. He listened for a moment, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. "Thank you," he breathed, and hung up. He turned to Thomas, and for the first time that night, the tight knot of fear in his expression loosened. A slow, exhausted smile touched his lips. "He's out," Julian said. Ellie got the charge reduced to a simple disorderly conduct. No name in the papers. Peter is on his way to a safe house upstate. Relief washed over Thomas, so potent and overwhelming it left him weak. He sank onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. They had done it. Their flimsy network of whispers and codes, their secret fund of crumpled bills, their careful, desperate planning, it had worked. They had saved someone. Julian came and sat beside him, his arm wrapping around Thomas's shoulders. The first light of morning was filtering into the studio, the soft gray light of a city waking up. They were exhausted, emotionally flayed, but they were not defeated. "One," Julian whispered, as if to himself. "We saved one." Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting Julian's. He saw the toll the night had taken on them, the dark circles under Julian's eyes, the weary slump of his shoulders. But he also saw a flicker of something new in their depths. The fierce, defiant pride of a victory, however small, won against impossible odds. The fight had taken its first bite out of them, and they had not broken. They had held the line. And in the quiet of that dawn, they both understood that this was their life now. A life of secret meetings and coded calls, of waiting in diners and holding their breath for a phone call. It was a life lived on a knife's edge. But as Julian leaned in and rested his forehead against Thomas's, the fear was overshadowed by the simple, profound truth of their shared purpose. They had a fortress to defend, and its walls they now knew would hold.
Part 6. The Weight of Whispers. Chapter 8. The rescue of Peter was a spark in the powder keg. Word of the Matachine's success, transmitted through the community's invisible telegraph of nods and glances, brought a surge of new energy. The phantom network grew, its tendrils reaching into corners of the city they hadn't known existed. The meetings in Julian's studio became more crowded, the hushed discussions more urgent. The coffee can in the bookstore filled faster. The hollowed-out book became heavier with crumpled bills.
Their small victory had proven that resistance was not futile. It had given them the most dangerous thing of all – hope. With growth came new challenges. The new faces brought new voices, and not all of them sang in harmony. A faction of younger, more impatient men, galvanized by the writings of Allen Ginsberg and the burgeoning beat movement, pushed for more direct action. They talked of protests, of public demonstrations, of forcing the city to see them. Hiding in the shadows and writing pamphlets isn't going to change anything, a young fiery poet named Leo declared at one tense meeting. They treat us like criminals because we act like criminals, skulking around in the dark. We need to march in the daylight. Thomas, standing sentinel by the door as he always did, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He saw the strategic folly in Leo's passion. "Marching in the daylight gets your picture in the paper," he countered, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the heated debate. "It gets you fired. It gets you evicted. It gets you beaten. A general doesn't send his army on a suicide mission." "This isn't an army, it's a movement! And I'm not a soldier, I'm a man!" Julian, who Thomas expected to side with Leo's defiant spirit, instead played the diplomat. He used his artist's charm to soothe frayed nerves, to find common ground, to remind them that their diversity of opinion was a strength, not a weakness. But Thomas could see the strain it took. The meetings, once a source of communal strength, were becoming a battleground of competing fears and desires. The weight of their secret war began to settle heavily on Thomas and Julian's relationship. The studio, once their sanctuary, now felt like a command center. Their conversations were less about art and history, and more about logistics and contingency plans. The telephone, once a connection to friends, was now a potential harbinger of crisis. The love story that had begun with a kiss in the moonlight was now being written in the coded language of their newsletters and the grim accounting of their secret ledger. Thomas became more withdrawn, more obsessed with the mechanics of their operation. He was the guardian of their fortress, and he saw threats everywhere. He would wake in the middle of the night to double-check the lock on the door, to listen for unfamiliar sounds on the street below. His pragmatism, which had once grounded Julian, now felt like a cage. For Julian, the endless caution was suffocating his spirit. The need for secrecy was a constant, dull ache. He chafed under the restrictions, the constant need to edit himself, to dim his own light. He wanted to walk down the street holding Thomas's hand. He wanted to be able to introduce him as his love, not his friend. He poured his frustration onto his canvases. His paintings became larger, angrier, the colors clashing with a violent intensity. He created a series of portraits of the men in their group, but he painted them with their faces obscured by shadows or bars of black paint, their mouths agape in silent screams. The paintings were brilliant, harrowing, and deeply unsettling. The breaking point came on an ordinary Thursday. Thomas came home from the docks, bone-weary and splattered with grime, to find the studio filled with a frantic energy. Julian was preparing for a secret art show. He and a few other artists had rented a vacant storefront for one night only. They would hang their most provocative work. Julian's portraits of the shadow men would be the centerpiece. It was an act of pure, unadulterated defiance. "It's madness, Julian," Thomas said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "It's like sending up a flare to the police and saying, 'Here we are, come and get us.'" "It's art, Thomas, it's truth. We're fighting for the right to be seen, but we're still hiding. These paintings need to be seen. These men, our friends, they deserve to be seen, even if it's just their shadows on a canvas." "What they deserve is to be safe." Thomas raised his voice, the raw frustration of months of pent-up fear finally breaking through his controlled exterior. "I spend every waking moment trying to keep this network, to keep you safe. I count the money, I plan the routes, I lie awake at night listening for the footstep on the stair that means it's all over, And you want to throw it all away for a single night of artistic vanity?" The words, once out, hung in the air, ugly and venomous. The accusation of vanity struck Julian like a physical blow. His face went white, his eyes wide with hurt. "Vanity?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "You think this is about my ego? I see what this fight is doing to us, Thomas. To you, you're disappearing. You're turning into a ghost, just like the men in my paintings. All you talk about is the fund, the codes, the danger. When was the last time you told me about your day? When was the last time we just danced?" He gestured to the record player in the corner, dusty from disuse. "That man that I met, the one with the storm in his eyes, the poet who read history books, where did he go? I'm trying to remind you, to remind all of us what we're fighting for. Not just to survive, but to live, to love, to create beautiful, true things. If we lose that, then they've already won." Thomas had no answer. Julian's words struck a chord of truth so deep that it resonated in his bones. He had become the warden of their prison. He had wrapped them so tightly in the armor of caution that they could no longer move, could no longer breathe. The silence that fell between them was a vast, cold chasm. It was the silence of two people who loved each other completely, but who were being ground down by the world they were trying to change. The fortress they had built together was strong, but the echoes of their own whispered fears and resentments were beginning to shake it from within. Julian turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "The show is tomorrow night," he said quietly, with his back to Thomas. "I won't ask you to come." Thomas watched him, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He loved this man's fire, his reckless, beautiful courage. It was the very thing that had drawn him out of his own shadows. But now he feared that same fire would be the thing to consume them both. The war for their right to exist was costing them the very love they were fighting for. And for the first time, Thomas felt a sliver of true despair. They might win the war, but he was terrified they would lose each other in the process. Part 7. A Light in the Storefront. Chapter 9. The next day at the docks was a special kind of hell. The familiar rhythm of the work, the straining of muscles and the shouting of men, usually provided a numbing solace for Thomas, but today it was just noise. Julian's words echoed in the space between the clang of steel and the cry of gulls. Where did he go? He looked at his own hands, calloused and stained, and felt a profound sense of alienation. He had become a machine of survival, a creature of logistics and fear. He had been so focused on reinforcing the walls of their fortress that he hadn't realized he was bricking them both inside. He thought of the man Julian had painted, the man with the storm in his eyes, and felt like a fraud. A storm that never breaks is just a sky full of pressure. Julian was fighting to feel the rain, to see the lightning, while Thomas was trying to board up the windows. He had mistaken Julian's courage for recklessness because he had forgotten what it felt like to be brave himself. He had survived a war, but he was losing the peace. He was losing the man who had taught him what peace could feel like. That evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, Thomas did not go straight back to the studio. He walked the long way, through the bustling heart of the village. He saw couples strolling hand in hand, their easy intimacy a casual dagger in his heart. He saw the life he and Julian were fighting for, a life that felt impossibly distant. He knew what he had to do. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar companion, but for the first time, he recognized it for what it was, a choice. He could choose to let it rule him, to let it turn him into the ghost Julian saw. Or he could choose to walk alongside it, to acknowledge its presence without letting it hold the leash. He found the address, an unassuming storefront on a side street, its windows covered with brown paper,
a single bare bulb burning over the door. He could hear the low murmur of voices from within. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The space was raw, the brick walls bare, the floorboards dusty, but it had been transformed. Canvases hung from wires, spotlit by cheap clamp lamps, creating dramatic islands of light in the gloom. It was a makeshift temple, and the 30 or so people gathered there were its silent, reverent congregation. They were the faces from the meetings, the secret tribe, their features softened and made vulnerable in the dim light. And then he saw the art. Julian's work dominated the room. The Shadow Men portraits were more powerful here than they had been in the studio. Hung together, they formed a collective cry of anguish and defiance. He saw Arthur's gentle eyes, haunted and erased by shadow. He saw Leo's defiant mouth, open in a scream no one could hear. He saw himself, the storm in his eyes warring with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He felt a hand slip into his. Julian was beside him, his face etched with a question. He hadn't expected Thomas to come. "It's true," Thomas said, his voice thick, his eyes still fixed on the paintings. He was echoing the words he'd said the first night in Julian's studio, but they held a new, deeper meaning now. He wasn't just talking about the art, he was talking about the act, the gathering, the risk. For an hour, they existed in a bubble of impossible grace. People spoke in whispers, sharing a bottle of cheap red wine, their eyes full of a painful, beautiful recognition. This was what Julian meant. This was what they were fighting for, the right to see themselves and to be seen by each other. The bubble popped with a sharp, authoritative rap on the glass of the front door. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Every head turned. Through the paper on the door they could see two silhouettes, the distinct shape of police caps. The low murmur of voices died, replaced by a silence so absolute it was a physical pressure. The fear Thomas had kept at bay came roaring back, cold and sickening. Panic began to ripple through the crowd. People started to back away from the door, their eyes wide with terror. This was it. The raid. The end of everything. But as the first wave of panic threatened to crest, Thomas felt a strange, cold calm descend upon him. This was the moment he had been planning for, the scenario he had run through in his mind 100 times. He was no longer paralyzed by the what if. He was in the what now. He released Julian's hand and moved to the center of the room. "Listen to me," he said, his voice not loud, but clear and commanding. It was the voice of a corporal taking charge of his frightened squad. Everyone froze, their panicked eyes fixing on him.
"There is a delivery entrance in the back." "Leo," he said, locking eyes with the fiery poet. "You know the alley. Take 3 people, go out and see if it's clear. No running, just walk." Leo, his face pale but his eyes resolute, nodded and disappeared with a small group into the back room. "The rest of you," Thomas continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "we take the art down, now. It's the only evidence they have." He turned to Julian. "The portraits," he said, his voice softening for just a moment. "They're the most important." The second knock on the door was harder, more impatient. A voice boomed from outside. "Police! Open the door!" No one panicked. A strange, focused energy filled the room. Under Thomas's calm direction, they became a silent, efficient team. Hands gently lifted canvases from the walls. The clamp lights were switched off, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the street lamp filtering through the papered windows. They moved with a quiet, desperate grace, a ballet of disassembly. Leo reappeared from the back. "It's clear," he hissed. "The alley opens onto the next street over." "Go," Thomas commanded in a low voice. "In pairs. Walk. Don't run. Meet at the diner, the one we all know. Go." People began to filter out through the back, melting into the night.
Julian was carefully stacking his portraits, his movements precise despite the trembling in his hands. Thomas stood between him and the front door, a solid, unmoving shield. The pounding started again, the wood of the door groaning. "Open this door, or we're breaking it down!" Only Thomas and Julian were left. "Go," Thomas said, not taking his eyes off the door. "Not without you," Julian replied, his voice fierce. "I'll be right behind you," Thomas promised. "Take the paintings. They can't have them. They can't erase this." Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes locking with Thomas's in the gloom. He saw the love, the promise, the unshakable resolve. He nodded, gathered the precious canvases, and slipped out the back. Thomas was alone. He took one last look at the empty, darkened room. It was just a vacant storefront again. But for a brief, brilliant moment, it had been a cathedral. He walked to the front door, took a deep breath, and turned the lock. 2 policemen spilled into the room, their faces flushed with anger. They shone their flashlights around the empty space, their beams cutting wildly through the darkness. They saw nothing. No art, no people. Just a dusty, empty room, and one man, standing there calmly, his hands in his pockets. "What's going on in here?" the lead officer demanded, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Thomas looked him straight in the eye. "Nothing," he said, his voice perfectly even. "I was just thinking of renting the place, but I've decided it's a little too dark for my taste." He had walked into the lion's den, but he had done it on his own terms. He had faced down his fear not by ignoring it, but by using the very skills it had honed in him to protect the thing he loved. He didn't know what would happen next, whether they would arrest him or just rough him up. But as he stood there, bathed in the harsh glare of their flashlights, he felt a profound sense of peace. The storm in his eyes had finally broken, and in its wake there was a quiet, unshakable strength. He was no longer a ghost. He was a guardian.
Part 8. The Price of a Dawn. Chapter 10. The precinct was a landscape Thomas knew intimately now, but this time he was not a bystander. He was the focus. They sat him in a small, windowless interrogation room that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. The 2 officers who had broken down the door, a burly, red-faced man named Kowalski and his younger, leaner partner, Miller, tried to break him down too. They used the classic techniques, good cop, bad cop. Kowalski loomed, his voice a torrent of threats and homophobic slurs, promising to make Thomas's life a living hell, to plaster his name across every newspaper in the city as a degenerate. Miller played the sympathetic one, offering him coffee, suggesting that if he just gave them some names, the artist, the people who were there, he could walk out and forget this ever happened. "We know what you are," Kowalski spat, his face inches from Thomas's. "We know what kind of filth was on those walls. Give us the artist's name." Thomas felt the cold tendrils of fear trying to wrap around his art. But he held on to the image of Julian disappearing into the alley, the canvases clutched in his hands. He held on to the memory of the faces in that room, their shared, fragile moment of community. He had a new anchor now, stronger than fear. He looked at Kowalski, his gaze as flat and unreadable as the gray Atlantic. He said the words Ellie had drilled into them, the phrase that had become their shield and their sword. "My name is Thomas Callahan. I live at 542 Barrow Street. I will not answer any questions without my attorney present." "Don't play coy with me, you. My name is Thomas Callahan. I will not answer any questions without my attorney present." He became a broken record, a wall of calm, infuriating resolve. The more they pushed, the more he retreated into that simple, legally sound mantra. His military training had taught him how to endure, how to detach his mind from his body in moments of extreme stress.
He was no longer in an interrogation room in Greenwich Village. He was on watch in the frozen Korean wilderness, his entire being focused on a single, vital task: hold the line. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Eleanor Vance swept in, her presence sucking the belligerent energy out of the room. She looked at the two officers with a gaze so cold it could have frozen mercury. "Officers Kowalski and Miller," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "My client has been held for 2 hours without charge and has repeatedly requested legal counsel, a request you have willfully ignored. Unless you plan on charging him with renting a vacant property, I suggest you release him into my custody immediately. Otherwise, we can discuss your flagrant violation of his civil liberties in front of a judge at 9 a.m. sharp. I'm sure your captain will be thrilled." Kowalski opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Ellie's face, a mask of righteous legal fury, made him snap it shut. They knew they had nothing. Without the art, without witnesses, all they had was an empty room and a man who wouldn't talk. With a muttered curse, Kowalski gestured to the door. Thomas was free to go. Ellie said nothing until they were out on the cold, damp street. "You did well," she said, the highest praise she was capable of giving. "Your training worked." "It wasn't just the training," Thomas said, breathing in the free night air as if for the first time. "It was knowing what I was protecting." She gave him the address for the diner and a rare, thin smile. "Go. Your people are waiting for you." The diner was a haven of light and warmth. The moment Thomas walked in, a collective sigh of relief went through the dozen or so people huddled in the back booths. And then Julian was there, launching himself into Thomas's arms, holding on with a desperate strength that belied his slender frame. He didn't say a word, just buried his face in the crook of Thomas's neck. Thomas held him tightly, the solid, real weight of him, a balm to his frayed nerves. The canvases were leaning against the wall of the booth, safe. They sat crammed together, drinking bitter coffee and piecing together the night. Leo, his earlier bravado replaced by a sober respect, clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "You were a general back there, a damn general." The fear had united them, burning away the factionalism and the arguments. They had faced the enemy, and through a combination of Julian's defiant art and Thomas's cool-headed strategy, they had won. They understood, in a way they hadn't before, that they were not two opposing sides of a movement. They were a necessary balance. They needed the poets to remind them why they fought, and they needed the soldiers to show them how to survive the fight. Later, as they walked the deserted streets back to the studio, the first tints of dawn were breaking over the East River. The sky was the color of a pearl. "They didn't get them," Julian said quietly, his hand finding Thomas's. This time, Thomas didn't let go. "The paintings, our friends, you, they didn't win." "No, they didn't." Back in the studio, the exhaustion hit them like a physical wave. Julian rehung one of the portraits, the one of Thomas. It looked different now in the soft morning light. The weariness in the painted eyes was still there, but the strength seemed more prominent. The storm less a sign of inner turmoil, and more a source of deep, controlled power. "There he is," Julian whispered, tracing the line of the jaw on the canvas. "The man I fell in love with." Thomas came up behind him, wrapping his arms around Julian's waist and resting his chin on his shoulder. They stood there for a long time, looking at the portrait together, the city waking up outside their window. The events of the night had stripped everything down to its essential core. The arguments, the fear, the tactical disagreements, they had all fallen away, leaving only the unshakable truth of their love and their shared purpose. "I was wrong," Thomas said, his voice a low murmur against Julian's ear. "The show wasn't vanity, it was a light. I was so afraid of the dark, I forgot how much we needed the light." Julian leaned back in his embrace, his body melting into Thomas's. "And I forgot,"
he said that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is have a plan for when they try to put the light out. They had paid a price for this dawn, in fear and adrenaline and sleeplessness. They knew there would be other nights, other raids, other fights. The war was far from over, but they had held the line. They had protected their own. They had looked into the face of the thing that was meant to break them, and they had not broken. As the sun finally climbed above the horizon, casting golden stripes across the studio floor, Thomas Callahan knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was finally home. He was no longer just surviving. He was fighting, and he was not fighting alone.
Part 9. The Unseen Eye. Chapter 11. In the clandestine world of the village, the story of the Phantom Art Show became whispered legend. It was a tale of defiance, a testament to the fact that they could outsmart the brutes in blue. The incident, which should have been a disaster, became a catalyst. The Mattachine Society, once a small band of frightened men, began to swell. Teachers, clerks, booksellers, even a few discreet professionals, drawn by the story of their victories, sought them out. They were tired of living in fear, and for the first time, they saw a tangible alternative. The growth forced them to evolve. The informal gatherings in Julian's studio gave way to a more structured council. By unspoken consensus, the leadership fell to the three who had been at the center of the storm. Ellie, the legal mind, Julian, the voice and heart, and Thomas, the strategist and shield. Thomas's role shifted in the eyes of the others. He was no longer just the quiet man who guarded the money. He was the general. They looked to him for guidance on security, on discretion, on how to move through a hostile city without being seen. He accepted the role with a heavy sense of responsibility. He taught them simple fieldcraft learned in the army. Always sit facing the door in a restaurant. Never take the same route home twice. Be aware of who is behind you. Small things that could make the difference between safety and ruin. Julian blossomed in the new atmosphere of hope. He channeled his energy into the lantern, expanding it from a single sheet to a multi-page stapled newsletter. It contained Ellie's legal advice, Thomas's security tips, and Julian's own soaring editorials on pride and history, connecting their struggle to the persecuted poets and artists of the past. He was giving them a history, a context, a sense that they were not an anomaly, but part of a long, hidden story. Their love, tested and forged in the fire of the raid, entered a new, deeper phase. The friction between them was replaced by a profound complementary partnership. They were two sides of the same coin, the artist and the soldier, each making the other stronger. The studio was once again a sanctuary, a place where they could shed the armor they wore outside, where they could simply be Thomas and Julian. But as the autumn leaves turned brittle and the first chill of winter crept into the city, a new, colder fear began to seep in through the cracks. It was not the sudden violent fear of a police raid, but something more insidious, a slow, creeping paranoia. It started with small, inexplicable things. A persistent clicking on the telephone line. Julian would be in the middle of a call, and the subtle, rhythmic tick-tick-tick would start, a sound just at the edge of hearing. When he'd mention it, the person on the other end wouldn't have heard a thing. Then came the feeling of being watched. Thomas, with his heightened senses, felt it most acutely. He'd be walking home from the docks and get a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He'd stop, turn, and see nothing but the usual anonymous city crowd. But the feeling would linger, the unnerving sense of an unseen eye following his every move.
One afternoon, a man in a drab gray suit and a bland gray hat knocked on the studio door. He claimed he was from the gas company, there to check for a suspected leak in the building. His credentials looked legitimate, but his eyes were all wrong. They weren't the eyes of a workman. They were the eyes of an observer, constantly scanning, cataloging, memorizing the layout of the room, the titles of the books on the shelf, the half-finished canvas on the easel. He found no leak and left, but the sterile scent of his presence remained. Thomas tried to dismiss it all as a side effect of their work, the phantom limb of past trauma. "We're spooked," he told Julian, trying to convince himself as much as him. "After the show, we're seeing ghosts everywhere." But the incidents grew harder to explain away. A meeting place, decided upon only hours before, would suddenly have a conspicuous police car parked across the street. A new member, after being vetted, would ask questions that were just a little too probing, a little too focused on names and affiliations. The breaking point for Thomas came on a Saturday. He was conducting one of his meticulous quarterly sweeps of the studio for their own peace of mind. He checked the phone, the light fixtures, the baseboards. It was mostly for show, a ritual to soothe their nerves. But this time, behind a heavy bookshelf they rarely moved, he found something. It was small, no bigger than my thumbnail, and attached to the wall with a dab of what looked like putty. A thin, hair-like wire snaked from it down into a tiny hole drilled through the floorboard. It wasn't a clumsy police bug. It was sophisticated, military grade, the kind of device he had only ever heard about in intelligence briefings. It was a listening device, a silent, patient ear that had been placed in the heart of their sanctuary. He stared at it, his blood turning to ice. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if a stranger had been walking through his memories, touching his most private thoughts. Every conversation, every argument, every whispered declaration of love, every secret Mattachine strategy session, it had all been recorded. They weren't just watching us. The ghosts were real. He carefully detached the device, his hands surprisingly steady. He wrapped it in a handkerchief and placed it on the small table in the center of the room. When Julian came home from buying groceries, he found Thomas sitting in the encroaching twilight, staring at the tiny object as if it were a venomous insect. "Thomas, what is it?" Julian asked, sensing the frigid atmosphere in the room. Thomas looked up, and the expression in his eyes made Julian's breath catch in his throat. It was a look he had never seen before, not in the police station, not during the raid. It was the look of a soldier who has just realized he is not fighting a skirmish, but a war against a vast, invisible, and infinitely more powerful army. "They're not just watching us, Julian," Thomas said, his voice a dead, hollow whisper. "They're listening to everything." The realization settled over them, heavy and suffocating. The clicks on the phone, the man in the gray suit, the feeling of being watched, it all snapped into terrifying focus. This wasn't the work of the NYPD. This was the federal government. This was J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. The Lavender Scare wasn't just a policy in Washington. It was here, in their home, a tiny, silent microphone that had turned their sanctuary into a cage.
Chapter 12. The discovery of the bug shattered their world. It was one thing to fight against the brutish, predictable thuggery of the local police. It was another thing entirely to be targeted by the shadowy, omnipotent machine of the federal government. The fight was no longer on the streets. It was in their minds, in their home, in the very air they breathed. They took the device to Ellie. In the sterile light of her office, she examined it without touching it, her face a grim mask. "I'll make some inquiries," she said, her voice low, "through channels that can't be traced back to me. Don't talk about this to anyone. Assume every phone is tapped, every room is bugged. From now on, the war is silent." The confirmation came a week later, not in a phone call, but during a walk through Central Park, the cold air stinging their cheeks. Ellie's source, a disgruntled clerk in the Justice Department who owed her a favor, had confirmed their worst fears. A special FBI task force under the umbrella of Hoover's CO Intelpro had been established to monitor and disrupt sexually deviant groups, which they considered as much of a threat to national security as the Communist Party. They were building files, they were identifying leaders. The goal was not arrest, it was neutralization. The nature of their enemy had changed, and so their tactics had to change as well. The large meetings in the studio ceased. The telephone tree was dismantled. Communication was reduced to the most primitive and secure methods. Dead drops in library books, coded messages chalked on brick walls and erased within the hour. Face-to-face meetings that required elaborate counter-surveillance measures to set up. Thomas, his grim paranoia now validated, became their spy master. He taught the inner circle how to spot a tail, how to use reflections in shop windows to check behind them, how to conduct a surveillance detection route, a long, convoluted journey through the city designed to flush out anyone who was following. Their lives became a constant, nerve-shredding exercise in tradecraft. The psychological toll was immense. The studio, their home, felt tainted. They stopped having important conversations there, the silence between them growing thick with unspoken words. They would write notes to each other on a small notepad, then burn the pages in an ashtray. The easy intimacy they had fought so hard to win was being choked by the ever-present, unseen eye. The pressure manifested in their work. Thomas became gaunt, his sleep plagued by nightmares of being followed. He was sharp, focused, but the quiet poet inside him was being buried under layers of tactical caution. Julian's art took a dark, claustrophobic turn. He began a new series he called the Panopticon. The paintings depicted solitary figures trapped in rooms where the wallpaper was a pattern of staring, disembodied eyes, where the light fixtures were shaped like ears. The vibrant colors of his earlier work were gone, replaced by a suffocating palette of grays, blacks, and bruised purples. Their unseen antagonist began to feel like a character in their lives. They nicknamed him the Man in the Gray Suit. They pictured him sitting in a sterile government office, listening to their recorded conversations, pinning their photographs to a corkboard. His face a bland mask of bureaucratic evil. He was no longer just a threat, he was a presence, an invisible third person in their relationship. Then the FBI made its first direct, cruel move. Arthur, the gentle playwright who had been their first rescue, had finally started to rebuild his life. After being fired from his government job, he had found a position teaching literature at a small progressive college in upstate New York. He was happy there, safe. One cold December morning, Julian received a letter from him. It was written on a single tear-stained page. The dean of his college had received an anonymous package. Inside was a photostatic copy of Arthur's original arrest record from that night at the cafe, along with a transcript, an actual typed-out transcript of his humiliating interrogation. He had been fired that morning, deemed morally unfit to teach the youth. The letter ended with a sentence that would haunt them all. They can reach you anywhere. Thomas and Julian read the letter together, standing in the cold silence of their studio. This was neutralization. It was a clear, brutal message sent directly to the leaders of the Mattachine Society. We know who you are, we know who you protect, and we can destroy you, any of you, at any time, without ever showing our faces.
The attack wasn't just on Arthur. It was on the very idea of their resistance. If they couldn't even protect the people they'd already saved, what was the point of it all? Despair, cold and absolute, began to seep into the foundations of their fortress. The man in the gray suit had stopped listening. He had started to play his game.
Part 10. The Long Shadow. Chapter 13. Arthur's letter was a poisoned dart. It didn't kill them, but the venom spread through the veins of their small movement, paralyzing it with a slow, creeping sickness. The studio became a mausoleum of their former hope. Julian would read the letter over and over, his knuckles white, as if trying to find a word or a phrase that would make it untrue. The final sentence, "They can reach you anywhere," became a malevolent mantra echoing in the silence between them. Julian's rage, which had once been a brilliant, cleansing fire, now turned inward, curdling into a toxic brew of guilt and impotence. "I did this to him," he whispered to Thomas one night, his voice raw. "I encouraged him to come to the meetings. I told him we could protect him. I filled his head with talk of pride and dignity, and all it got him was ruin." He went to his canvases, the powerful Panopticon series, and one by one, he turned them to face the wall. He couldn't bear to look at the eyes he had painted. He felt like a fraud. The artist who had preached the gospel of being seen now understood the terrifying price of visibility. For Thomas, the news was a catastrophic intelligence failure. He had built a fortress, but the enemy hadn't laid siege to it. They had simply bypassed it and assassinated one of his citizens 100 miles away. His strategic mind reeled, not with emotion, but with the cold, brutal calculus of his defeat. He saw Arthur not as a friend, but as a casualty, a pawn sacrificed by the enemy to demoralize the troops. This coldness was his only defense against the overwhelming despair. If he allowed himself to feel the human cost, he knew he would shatter. The news spread like a contagion through the Medici network. The next scheduled meeting was a disaster. Only half the usual number showed up, and their faces were pinched with a new, deeper fear. The bravado was gone. Leo, the poet who had once called for marches in the street, sat hunched in a corner, utterly silent. The invisible enemy had done what 100 uniformed police officers could not. It had broken their spirit. "What do we tell people?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. "How can we ask them to join us, to risk everything, when we can't guarantee their safety?" Ellie Vance, ever the pragmatist, laid out the grim reality. "We can't guarantee it," she said, her voice devoid of any comforting platitudes. "The Bureau is not bound by the same rules we are. They are operating in the shadows of the law. What they did to Arthur is legally ambiguous and morally bankrupt, but it is also brutally effective." The meeting dissolved without a plan, without a single spark of their old defiance. The architecture of resistance, so carefully constructed, seemed to be collapsing under the weight of a single, well-aimed letter. In the weeks that followed, the silence in the studio became a physical presence. Julian stopped painting entirely. He stopped writing for the lantern. The mimeograph machine sat in the corner, gathering dust. He and Thomas moved around each other like strangers, their shared grief a wall between them. The easy physical comfort they once shared felt like a distant memory. Every touch felt freighted with the sorrow of their failure. While Julian retreated from the world, Thomas went deeper into the mind of his enemy. He spent his evenings at the New York Public Library, losing himself in the vast reading room under the soft glow of the green-domed lamps. He wasn't reading history or poetry. He was reading about psychological warfare, about counterintelligence, about the strategies of totalitarian states. He was trying to understand the beast that was hunting them. He filled notebooks with diagrams, with theories, with profiles of men like J. Edgar Hoover. He was no longer just a soldier defending a position. He was becoming a spy master, a man who had to think like his opponent to survive. One night, Julian found him hunched over the kitchen table, which was covered in a chaotic mosaic of notes and newspaper clippings. Thomas was so engrossed, he didn't hear him approach. "What is this, Thomas?"
Julian asked, his voice weary. "This is the battle plan," Thomas said, his eyes wild with a feverish, sleep-deprived intensity. "They use isolation, fear, shame. They turn us against each other. They make us invisible. It's a war of attrition. They win by making us give up." Julian looked at the obsessive, paranoid scrawls, and something inside him broke. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't live like this, in a constant state of war, looking over my shoulder, burning every note, afraid of the sound of my own telephone. I look at you, and I don't see the man I love. I see a general in a bunker planning a war he can't win." He reached out and grabbed Thomas's hand, his grip desperate. "Let's leave," he pleaded, his eyes swimming with tears. "Let's just go. We can sell my paintings. We can go to Tangier or Paris or anywhere they won't look for us. We can have a life, a real life, Thomas. Just you and me. Please. We've lost. Let's just surrender and save ourselves." Thomas looked at Julian, at the profound, soul-deep exhaustion in his face. He saw the escape, the tantalizing promise of peace. For a single fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine it, a small, sun-drenched apartment, a life without codes or fear, a world where he could wake up next to Julian and not immediately think about surveillance. But then he looked down at his own notes, at the cold, hard facts of their enemy's strategy. They win by making us give up. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the man in the gray suit would not stop at the water's edge. Hoover's reach was long. The feeling of being watched would follow them, and even if it didn't, they would be exiles, running from a battle they had abandoned. They would have saved their bodies, but lost their souls. He gently pulled his hand from Julian's grasp. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Why? Why are you choosing this over us?" Julian choked out, a sob catching in his throat. "Because there is no us if we run," Thomas said, his eyes locking with Julian's, pleading for him to understand. "They want to erase us, Julian, not just from our jobs or our homes. They want to erase the very idea of us. They want to make it so that no one ever knows we existed, that we loved, that we fought. Running away is just helping them do their job. It's a slower form of erasure." He paused, a new, radical, and terrifying idea beginning to form in his exhausted mind. "We can't outfight them. We can't outrun them. The only way to win is to make a record they can't destroy, to create a history they can't erase." Julian stared at him, bewildered. "A history? What are you talking about?" "I don't know yet, but I know we can't win by hiding. We tried that. And we can't win by fighting in the streets. We know what that will lead to. We have to find a new front, a new battlefield." He stood up, his weariness replaced by a grim, dangerous resolve. The soldier had realized that the tactics of defense were no longer enough. The spymaster knew that the only way to beat an enemy who thrives in the shadows is to drag the fight, kicking and screaming, into the light. He didn't know how, but he knew why. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting for memory.
Part 11. The Weapon of Truth. Chapter 14. Thomas's radical idea, born from the depths of his despair, hung in the air between them. A new battlefield, a history they can't erase. To Julian, who had been pleading for an escape, the words were abstract, confusing. He saw only the endless, grinding war stretching out before them. The gulf between his desire for peace and Thomas's grim resolve felt wider than ever. The days that followed were the coldest of their lives, and not just because of the bitter January wind that rattled the studio windows. They were living in a stalemate of the heart. Julian would sit for hours by the window, staring at the gray city, a ghost in his own home.
Thomas would pore over his notes, his mind a frantic engine of strategy, trying to give shape to his impossible idea. He knew their enemy's primary weapon was shame, enforced by secrecy. The FBI's power came from the fact that their victims were too terrified to ever speak of what was being done to them. Arthur hadn't gone to the press. He had just disappeared, swallowed by the silence. The Bureau operated in the dark because it knew its targets would never dare to turn on the light. That, Thomas realized, is the new front. He found his answer not in a military textbook, but in a small, dusty volume of American history he checked out from the library. It was a book about the muckrakers of the early 20th century, journalists like Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair who had used the power of the press to expose the corrupt underbelly of corporate and political America. They hadn't used bombs or guns. They had used facts. They had weaponized the truth. He brought the idea to Ellie, meeting her on a windswept ferry crossing to Staten Island, the icy spray providing a cover for their conversation. "We can't fight the Bureau in the courts," he said, his words nearly snatched away by the wind. "We can't fight them in the streets. We have to fight them on the front page." Ellie looked at him, her expression skeptical. "With what army, Thomas? No reputable newspaper would touch this story. They'd be accused of being communist sympathizers or worse. The political climate is poison." "I know," Thomas said, "so we don't go to them. We become our own newspaper." He laid out his plan. It was audacious, reckless, and utterly unprecedented. The Mattachine Society would publish a report. Not a newsletter of coded warnings and editorials, but a meticulously researched, fact-based document detailing the federal government's systematic persecution of its homosexual citizens. It would name the executive order. It would detail the methods of entrapment and interrogation. It would include anonymous but verified first-hand accounts of men like Arthur. It would be dry, legalistic, and irrefutable. And they would send it to every member of Congress, every major news outlet in the country, and every church leader in the country. "It's a suicide mission," Ellie said flatly, though Thomas could see a flicker of something, intrigue perhaps, even admiration in her eyes. "They will bring their full weight down on whoever is responsible. They'll use every dirty trick they have to discredit it, to destroy the people who wrote it." "I know," Thomas said, "but that's the point. They can't do it in the dark anymore. We'll be forcing their hand, making them show themselves in the light of day. It's a poison pill strategy. They can swallow us, but we'll take them down with us." Ellie was silent for the rest of the ferry ride, her sharp mind dissecting the plan, weighing the immense risks against the potential, however slim, for a monumental shift in the landscape. When the ferry docked, she turned to him. "You'll need a witness, someone credible, with nothing to lose, who is willing to put their name to their story. An anonymous report can be dismissed as propaganda. You need a human face." The human face. Thomas knew instantly who it had to be, and the thought filled him with a dread that was colder than the winter air. He brought the plan to Julian that night. He didn't try to persuade him. He simply laid out the strategy, the risks, the almost certain self-destruction it entailed. He was offering not a solution, but a sacrifice. Julian listened, his expression unreadable. The artist who had once yearned for visibility was now being presented with a plan that would create the ultimate, catastrophic exposure. When Thomas was finished, the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of their future. "A human face," Julian said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They need to see the man in the painting. But they don't need the general. They need the soldier, the one who came home with a medal for bravery and a secret that was tearing him apart, the one who survived a war and deserves to live in peace in his own country." He turned to face Thomas, and for the first time in weeks, his eyes were clear. The fog of his despair burned away by a terrible, blazing clarity. "This report can't just be about the government," he said. "It has to be about us, about why we're a threat, not because we're security risks, but because we love. That is the truth they're terrified of." He took a deep breath. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll be your human face. My family has money. They have a name. They can't erase me as easily as they did Arthur. I will write my own story. My name, my face, my love for you. It will be the first chapter of your report. Let them come for me. Let them see who they are trying to destroy." Thomas stared at him, his heart stopping in his chest. This was not what he had intended. He had planned to be the martyr, to be the one to fall on the grenade. He had never, ever imagined Julian would volunteer. "No," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "Absolutely not. They will crucify you, Julian. They will destroy your name, your family, everything." "And if we do nothing, they will destroy our souls," Julian countered, his voice ringing with a conviction that shook the room. "You taught me that, Thomas. You, with your strategies and your courage, you taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even if you know you're going to lose. You pulled me back from the edge of despair by showing me a new way to fight." He stepped closer, taking Thomas's face in his hands. "Don't you see? This is how we win. Not by hiding, not by running, but by telling the truest story we know. My love for you is not a security risk. It is the strongest, most honorable thing in my life. Let them put that on trial. Let the world see who they're trying to destroy." In that moment, the artist and the soldier truly became one. Julian was offering his heart as a shield, and Thomas, the eternal guardian, was being asked to let him. It was the most terrifying strategic decision of his life. To protect the man he loved, he had to let him walk into the fire. He looked into Julian's eyes, and he saw no fear, only love and a fierce, unbreakable resolve. He had found his battlefield, and now he had found his champion. The poison pill had a name, and his name was Julian.
Part 12. The Report. Chapter 15. The winter of 1954 was the most brutal of their lives. The decision to move forward with the report transformed the studio into a hermetically sealed war room. The three of them, Thomas, Julian, and Ellie, became a single-minded entity fueled by black coffee, grim determination, and the knowledge that they were building a bomb that would likely detonate in their own hands. Thomas was the architect of the main body of the report. He worked with a cold, relentless precision, gathering the data, the statutes, the timelines. He compiled the anonymous stories of a dozen men, conducting interviews in hushed tones on park benches and in the back pews of empty churches. He stripped the accounts of all emotion, leaving only a skeleton of irrefutable facts, dates of arrest, badge numbers, verbatim quotes from interrogations. The result was a document of chilling bureaucratic horror, a mirror held up to the state, reflecting its own monstrous machinery. Ellie was the legal artisan, sharpening every sentence into a razor's edge. She vetted every claim, confirmed every statute, and wrote a blistering, brilliant legal preamble that framed their persecution not as a moral crusade, but as a flagrant violation of the Constitution. She was building a cage of law and logic from which she hoped not even the FBI could easily escape. And Julian, he wrote the heart. He sat for days at the small wooden desk, the portrait of Thomas his only witness. He did not write an angry polemic. He wrote a love story. He wrote about the first time he saw Thomas in the police station, a bastion of quiet strength in a room full of fear. He wrote about the docks at dawn, about the stories of the war, about the profound, life-altering experience of being truly seen by another person.
He wrote about their shared fear, their arguments, and the unshakable bond that had been forged between them. He described his love for Thomas not as a political statement, but as the central defining truth of his existence. He laid his soul bare on the page, offering his vulnerability as the ultimate act of defiance. He titled his section simply, "My name is Julian Croft. This is my history." When he finally let Thomas read it, Thomas wept. He wept for the beauty of their love, for the terrible bravery of the man who had captured it on the page, and for the certain knowledge that the world would try to desecrate it. In early March, the report was finished. It was a thick, formidable document of over 100 pages. They called it The Secure and the Scared. Using a mimeograph machine they had bought with the last of the Matachin funds, they spent 3 sleepless nights printing 200 copies, the rhythmic thump-chunk of the machine, the only sound in the studio. The air grew thick with the smell of ink and ozone, the smell of their revolution. They stuffed the reports into thick manila envelopes, each one addressed by hand to a senator, a congressman, a news editor, a bishop. On a cold gray morning, Thomas and Julian carried the 2 heavy mailbags to a large anonymous post office in Midtown. They didn't speak. Every step felt momentous, a footfall in a history only they could hear. They stood before the brass maw of the mail slot, the point of no return. Julian looked at Thomas, his eyes clear and calm. He said, "Whatever happens, we did this together." "Together," Thomas echoed, his voice thick. One by one, they pushed the envelopes into the darkness. It felt less like mailing letters and more like posting the banns of their own execution. As the last envelope disappeared, a profound and terrifying silence descended. The bomb was in the mail. Now all they could do was wait for the explosion. The first week was the worst. The silence from the outside world was absolute. No articles appeared in the papers, no politicians made statements. It was as if their report, their declaration of war, their collective scream had been dropped into a void. The paranoia was a physical sickness. Had the mail been intercepted? Had their work been for nothing? The silence broke on a Tuesday morning, not with a whisper, but with a roar. The headline was on the front page of a notorious tabloid, a paper known for its vicious sensationalism. The letters were a foot high, stark and brutal. "Society degenerate confesses sordid affair, attacks FBI." Underneath was Julian's photograph, a handsome, smiling picture a society paper had run years ago, now rendered sinister. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. They twisted Julian's heartfelt testimony into a sordid confession. His love for Thomas was described as a perverse obsession. His art was dismissed as the ramblings of a diseased mind. The report's factual legal arguments were ignored entirely. An anonymous source from the Bureau was quoted calling the report a communist-inspired smear tactic designed to weaken the moral fiber of the nation. And in the final, cruelest blow, they printed a statement from Julian's estranged father, disowning him completely, calling him a source of shame to the Croft name.
Part 13. The Echo of a Roar. Chapter 16. The article was a public crucifixion. Strangers on the street recognized Julian, pointing, whispering, sometimes spitting a curse. His gallery, which had once championed his work, took down his paintings overnight. He was an outcast, a pariah, the city's newest cautionary tale. But in the studio, behind the locked door, there was no shame. Thomas took one look at the newspaper, at the vicious, ugly words, and he did something he hadn't done in years. He laughed. It was a short, harsh, humorless sound. "They were afraid," he said, his voice full of a strange, wild elation. Julian stared at him, bewildered. "Don't you see, Julian?" Thomas said, grabbing his shoulders.
This is what they do when they're afraid. They don't have a counter-argument. They don't have facts. All they have is filth. They're screaming because we hurt them." He was right. The sheer viciousness of the attack was a sign of its effectiveness. A report they could ignore wouldn't warrant such a prominent, hysterical response. Thomas's poison pill was working. The Bureau had swallowed it, and now they were showing the world their sickness. The proof came 2 days later, in a small, unexpected corner. A columnist for the Village Voice, a man known for his intellectual rigor and contrarian streak, wrote a piece. He didn't defend Julian. He didn't praise the report. He simply asked a question. He wrote, "One may find Mr. Croft's personal life distasteful. One may disagree with the conclusions of his society's report, but one must, as a citizen, ask why the Federal Bureau of Investigation is dedicating its considerable resources to the public destruction of a single artist. Is this the proper role of a national police force, or is it the act of a political entity attempting to silence a dissenting voice?" It was a crack, a tiny hairline fracture in the monolithic wall of silence and condemnation. That column was followed by a letter to the editor in a more mainstream paper, written by a law professor, questioning the constitutionality of the executive order. The Mattachine Society's phone, which had been silent, began to ring with calls from other cities, from small, hidden groups of men and women who had seen the article and, instead of being scared, had been inspired. They wanted a copy of the report. They wanted to start their own chapters. The FBI had intended to make Julian an example, to terrify anyone who might dare to speak out. But they had miscalculated. In their attempt to destroy one man, they had inadvertently amplified his voice, sending the echoes of his story and Thomas's report across the country. They had wanted to make him a monster, but for a brave and hidden few, they had made him a hero. The war was far from over. The path ahead was long and fraught with danger. But something had irrevocably shifted. Their love story, once a secret whispered in a darkened room, was now part of a national conversation. Their history, which they had fought to write, could no longer be erased. Epilogue, June 1969. The studio was older now, the floorboards more scuffed, the walls covered with new canvases. The city lights outside the window shone on a New York that was both the same and unrecognizably different. Thomas and Julian were older too. The dark of Julian's hair was threaded with silver, and the lines around Thomas's eyes spoke of a life spent watching, worrying, and loving. They had survived. Their love had survived. Julian's art, once scandalous, was now studied in universities. His Panopticon series hailed as a vital document of a dark chapter in American history. The Mattachine Society, which had nearly been destroyed, had planted the seeds for a movement that was now growing in ways they had never imagined. On a hot, humid Friday night, a siren wailed in the distance. It was a common sound, but this one was different. It was followed by another, and another. Then came a new sound, a sound of shouting, of breaking glass, a human roar that vibrated through the floor of the studio. Thomas went to the window. A few blocks away, towards a bar with a green door called the Stonewall Inn, the night sky was alive with flashing lights. But it wasn't a raid they were witnessing. It was a rebellion. It was the children of their struggle, a new generation of angry, defiant, beautiful young people who were not writing reports or hiding in the shadows. They were fighting back with bricks and fists and fury. They were refusing to be afraid. Julian came and stood beside him, his arms sliding around Thomas's waist. They watched the chaos, the beautiful, terrifying birth of a revolution. All their work, their fear, their sacrifice, it had all led to this. "Look at them," Julian whispered, his voice thick with awe. "They're not asking for permission." "We did," Thomas said quietly, "so they wouldn't have to." He looked at Julian, at the face he had loved for almost 2 decades. He reached up and brushed a stray lock of silver hair from his forehead. The whispers of the city had long since faded, replaced by this new, defiant roar. Their personal history, forged in secret, had become a public prologue. They had held the line. They had kept the light on in the dark. And now, finally, the dawn was breaking.